Wonderful. Wonderful. That's the next generation.
14 hours. That is all that separated a man dancing in front of a live band, completely in command of his body, from a 911 call that arrived too late to matter. 14 hours, and somewhere inside that gap, a version of events exists that the official record never fully captured, pieced together only later from recordings nobody was supposed to keep. If you have ever wondered how someone can look that alive on Tuesday night and be gone by Thursday afternoon, the answer is not a single moment. It is a slow accumulation of small failures, spread out hour by hour, almost none of which made headlines on their own. Stack them together, though, in order, and they tell a story the public has never actually heard laid out this way before. So let's lay it out exactly that way, starting at the beginning of that final stretch and counting forward toward the moment everything stopped. Before we start the clock, it helps to understand why those final hours carried so much pressure in the first place. He was 50 years old, attempting a comeback the entire industry had bet heavily on. 50 sold-out shows booked for London, a production budget unlike anything attempted before, and a financial obligation hovering near $400 million that made failure simply not an option for anyone involved. Insiders who worked the production later described two completely different versions of him existing inside the same body during these final weeks. In daylight, surrounded by dancers and musicians, he was sharp, demanding, focused on details so small most audiences would never notice them. Away from the cameras, in the hours nobody was supposed to record, something else was happening entirely. And that contrast is exactly why counting these final 14 hours matters so much. 14 hours before the call, he is on a soundstage at the Staples Center, rehearsing Earth's Song in front of a full crew. Witnesses there that night describe something almost startling. After weeks of visible exhaustion, he performs with a vibrancy that catches people off guard, standing in front of projected footage of environmental devastation as if delivering one final plea to a planet he will never see age further. Nobody in that room has any reason to believe they are watching his last full performance. If anything, the energy convinces several people nearby that the worst of his struggles might finally be behind him. 12 hours before the call, the rehearsal has ended and he returns home to the rented mansion on Carrollwood Drive. His energy from the stage already beginning to fade. This is the part almost nobody talks about because it is also around this point that a private recording was later made, one capturing him slow and slurred, describing a dream that has nothing to do with the show at all. He talks about wanting to build a hospital for children who have no one else advocating for them. He says the songs he writes come from his own pain, that he understands suffering because he has lived inside it most of his life. Does not sound like a performance. It sounds like a man who genuinely believes nobody outside that room will ever hear him say it. 10 hours before the call, sedative medications are administered inside that same bedroom, which has effectively become an unofficial medical unit. He is still searching for sleep that simply will not come, the kind of exhaustion that conventional medication stopped touching months earlier. This is the point where almost every account of his final hours begins to blur, because what should have been a quiet, monitored process instead unfolds without the equipment or oversight any actual hospital would require. 2 hours before the call, he asks for something stronger. He asks for propofol, an anesthetic with no legitimate use outside a controlled operating room, and somehow inside that house it is simply available. This single request is the hinge the entire timeline turns on. Everything before it is a story about exhaustion. Everything after it becomes a story about negligence. Less than 1 hour before the call, a long silence settles over the bedroom, the kind that, in hindsight, represented the exact window where intervention might still have changed the outcome. Nobody in the house seems to register how much time has actually passed. The call itself comes at 12:26 in the afternoon, and what happens in the minutes immediately surrounding it is some of the most disputed testimony in the entire case. His bodyguard, Alberto Alvarez, later described walking into the bedroom to find a physician performing resuscitation directly on the mattress, a method any trained paramedic will tell you is functionally useless, while the artist's own children stood frozen nearby, watching something no child should ever witness. Alvarez testified that before anyone even placed the call, he was instructed to gather and conceal several medical vials and an amphor bag containing a milky substance. Not during the emergency, before it. That detail, the instinct to hide evidence first and seek help second, became one of the most damaging pieces of testimony presented at trial, the kind prosecutors returned to again and again while building their case. What makes this particular minute of the timeline so unsettling is how routine it apparently felt to the people inside that room. as though concealing medication before calling for help was simply one more task to complete rather than a decision that would later be scrutinized in front of a jury. When paramedics finally arrived, critical information about what had actually been administered was withheld from them, leaving first responders to treat what looked like a routine collapse instead of a chemically induced emergency requiring an entirely different response. At UCLA Medical Center, a full team worked for nearly an hour using every resource available. Made no difference. At 2:26 in the afternoon, almost exactly 14 hours after that final rehearsal performance, the King of Pop was pronounced dead. And within hours the news had slowed entire internet platforms under the sheer volume of people trying to confirm it was actually real. Less than 3 weeks later, more than 17,000 people filled the Staples Center for a memorial watched live by tens of millions more. Stevie Wonder offered a soulful reflection on a life that had reshaped popular music. Mariah Carey's voice cracked under the weight of the moment as she sang. For a few hours, an entire planet seemed to share a single emotion at the same time, and that emotion was disbelief because almost nobody outside his closest circle understood, until much later, exactly how fragile the 14 hours leading up to that afternoon had actually been. Here is where the timeline most people know simply stops. But the recordings connected to this case did not stop there, and neither did the questions they raised. His sister LaToya became the most vocal public figure, rejecting the idea that this was simply tragic negligence. She has insisted repeatedly that the people surrounding her brother in those final 14 hours, and in the weeks leading up to them, created an environment dangerous enough to kill him, and that Dr. Conrad Murray, while certainly responsible, was never operating in complete isolation. Investigators disagreed. In 2011, a jury convicted Murray of involuntary manslaughter, sentencing him to 4 years, of which he ultimately served 2, before his medical licenses were stripped across the country and he left the United States entirely. For LaToya, that verdict closed a legal case without closing the actual question. Her public statements ignited a firestorm that split the family in front of cameras, with some relatives backing her and others quietly distancing themselves from claims they felt could never hold up in court. Reporters chased every new statement she gave, and for months it seemed the family's grief and the family's suspicion had become impossible to separate, each one amplifying the other in front of an audience that refused to look away. His daughter Paris would later go even further. In a candid interview given once she was old enough to speak entirely in her own words, she stated plainly that she believes her father was murdered. She described his final months as defined by exhaustion bordering on collapse, and recalled him voicing genuine fear that people close to him were working against his interests. She has never denied that Murray was convicted. She simply does not believe his conviction tells the complete story, viewing him instead as one piece inside a much larger systemic failure involving the small circle of people managing his comeback and the money attached to it. For her, this has never been tabloid speculation. It is a conviction shaped by what she personally witnessed inside that house in the months leading up to those final 14 hours. This is also where it becomes important to separate documented fact from decades of noise, because his life has always existed at exactly that intersection. The persistent claim that he deliberately altered his skin tone was eventually disproven by medical records confirming vitiligo, a legitimate pigment disorder with no connection to vanity or denial of his heritage. Theories claiming his death was staged have circulated for years with zero supporting evidence, dismissed by every official investigation that has ever examined them. Serious legal accusations earlier in his career resulted in a full acquittal in 2005, though public suspicion surrounding them never fully faded from collective memory. One leaked recording even captures a voice describing advice he reportedly received from people profiting off his career, advice suggesting it was financially easier to quietly settle false accusations than fight them publicly in court. That single detail reframes nearly everything else about him, suggesting a man who had learned, painfully, that the people protecting his public image were not always protecting him personally. It is the kind of context that changes how you listen to everything else in this timeline, because it suggests that the instinct to manage appearances rather than address real problems did not begin in those final 14 hours. It had been the operating pattern of his entire adult life. Now rewind further than 14 hours, back into the final weeks of rehearsal, because the same pattern shows up again and again once you know where to look for it. Watch the choreography for Billie Jean, and you see a 50-year-old man chasing the exact precision of his 25-year-old self, returning to the same 8 count over and over until his signature glide looked untouched by time. Crew members described him shivering between takes, visibly fatigued, sessions stopping and restarting because his body simply could not sustain what his mind still demanded of it. For Smooth Criminal, a routine built around a digitized version of his own heartbeat and an anti-gravity lean made possible by specialized footwear he had personally co-patented. He insisted on revisiting every transition himself, treating a trick invented decades earlier as though it still had to be earned all over again. Almost nobody watching that performance understood how it was actually achieved, a mechanism precise enough that he had spent years perfecting the engineering behind a single illusion, and revisiting it now, decades later, with a body that was no longer 25 required more than nostalgia. It required trusting that his strength, however diminished, would still be enough to make it convincing one final time. For Thriller, reborn with modern staging layered over its original 1980s bones, soundboard recordings confirmed something almost stubborn in him. Even visibly depleted, he refused to alter the song's original pitch after nearly 30 years, refusing to let exhaustion change a single note fans had long since memorized as sacred. For Beat It, witnesses described a man obsessed with synchronization, refusing to let a single beat fall out of place even as he chose to mime certain sections rather than sing them at full volume, quietly conserving an energy reserve that was clearly running low. For Jam, the energy swung in the opposite direction entirely, deliberately aggressive and industrial, built around tight militaristic formations and a suit embedded with hundreds of small lights designed to make him appear to materialize directly out of the screen behind him. Even there, exhausted and privately struggling, he refused to let anyone else carry the vocal weight of the verses, insisting on rapping them himself, as though conceding even one more piece of the performance would mean conceding something far larger he was not yet ready to give up. For I'll Be There, the tone shifted entirely. Rather than spectacle, he wanted intimacy, weaving in remastered footage from his earliest years with Motown so audiences could watch the boy and the man exist on stage in the same breath. He insisted on stripping the arrangement down to little more than piano and bass, removing the safety net of backing tracks so his voice alone would carry the room. Working closely with his longtime vocal coach, he ran a cappella passages over and over, testing how far his sound could travel into the far corners of the venue without artificial support. People who witnessed those sessions described something almost vulnerable in his insistence on doing it that exposed, as though proving to himself one more time, that the instrument underneath all the production still worked, even as the 14-hour window that would end his life was already approaching. Put all of that next to the 14-hour window we just walked through, and a single, uncomfortable pattern emerges. This was never one bad decision made in one bad moment. It was weeks of small warning signs, compressed finally into a single afternoon where every one of those warning signs converged at once. The shivering during rehearsals, the repeated requests for stronger sedation, the insurance conversations weighing his stamina against contractual obligations. None of it existed in isolation. All of it had been building toward those final 14 hours long before anyone outside his inner circle had any reason to suspect how close to the edge he actually was. That is what makes this timeline different from how the story usually gets told. Most retellings treat his death as a single, isolated tragedy, a moment of medical malpractice that happened to occur on one unlucky afternoon. But laid out hour by hour, 14 hours before that call back to weeks of visible strain, it becomes something closer to a slow-motion collapse that almost everyone around him had some opportunity to notice and almost no one chose to stop. Think about how differently this story reads once you stop treating it as a single event and start treating it as a countdown that had actually been running for weeks before anyone called it one. The shivering during Beat It rehearsals was hour -200, in a sense, if you trace the pattern back far enough. The insurance conversation weighing his stamina against contractual obligations was hour -500. Every one of these moments existed on the same continuous clock, even though nobody treated them that way at the time. It is only in hindsight, with access to recordings that were never meant to be heard, that the full shape of that countdown becomes visible, and that visibility is exactly what makes this particular version of his story so difficult to look away from once you start. If there is one thing these recordings and timelines keep proving, decade after decade, it is that the official version of his final day was never the complete version. Each new fragment that surfaces fills in another hour, another conversation, another small decision that, on its own, seems forgettable, but together forms a portrait of exactly how someone that famous, that talented, and that surrounded by people could still end up that alone in the moment it mattered most. The tragedy was never just what happened in those final 14 hours. It was everything that happened in the weeks before them that made those 14 hours almost inevitable. Somewhere between a stage built for 50 triumphant nights in London and a quiet, ordinary bedroom where a body finally gave out, there is a version of this story nobody got to witness in real time, one that only exists now because fragments of it kept refusing to stay buried, surfacing years later in courtrooms, in family interviews, and in recordings that were never supposed to leave that room at all. If walking through those 14 hours changed how you see his final day, tell us in the comments which hour hit you hardest, and subscribe so you don't miss the next piece of this story when it surfaces.